Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week we're joined by Vincent Reina to share findings from the study of a new approach to delivering rent assistance to low-income tenants. The pilot program, operating out of Philadelphia, compares outcomes for tenants who receive direct cash assistance to those receiving traditional housing vouchers, as well as eligible households who don't receive any financial assistance. As we've talked about in episodes from late 2024 and early 2025, housing vouchers provide critical assistance to low-income renters in the U.S., but many end up going unused. One big reason why is the difficulty of finding a landlord who accepts vouchers, a problem that could be solved, the thinking goes, if tenants don't have to use a voucher to pay at all. With cash deposited into their bank accounts instead, recipients may be less stigmatized and gain more autonomy in deciding where to live and how they want to balance housing cost, location, and quality. 2 years into the pilot, the results are promising. Evictions and homelessness are down, and while tenants who receive housing vouchers end up with fewer housing quality concerns than those who received cash, both groups see big improvements over those who got neither. And as Vincent emphasizes, the study is also a great illustration of how academics and local governments can partner to test reforms that can later be scaled up. And it's a model for research that's both methodologically sound and sensitive to the needs and experiences of its subjects. I neglected to name Vincent's co-authors at the start of the interview, so allow me to fix that now. The Cityscape article from earlier this year was authored by Vincent, Matthew Fowle, Sarah Jaffe, Rachel Mulberry, and Miranda Fortenberry, and the report on outcomes 2 years into the pilot program includes all those already mentioned, plus Mimi Tansky. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Brett Berndt, and Tiffany Liu. Send your questions and feedback to Shane Phillips at ucla.edu. Tell your friends and colleagues about us. And urban planners, remember that you can get AICP credit for listening. With that, let's get to our conversation with Vincent Reina. Vincent Reina is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania, among many other titles, and was a senior advisor on housing and urban policy with the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Biden, and he's here to share his research on an alternative approach to delivering rent assistance to low-income households, one that provides cash directly to tenants instead of landlords. Vincent, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And my co-host today is Mike Lenz. Hey, Mike.
Hello, Shane. Hello, Vincent. Great to be here.
As always, we start off each episode asking our guest for a tour of a place they know well. So where are you telling us about today, Vincent?
So I'm going to tell you about the wonderful city of Philadelphia, which I know Mike recently visited, and hopefully, Shane, you'll come out this way soon if you haven't been here recently.
I've never been. I'm embarrassed to say. Somehow, I do want to visit. I guess now is not the time of year, but hopefully it won't be too long.
Fall in Philadelphia is absolutely wonderful. So I live in a neighborhood called Queen Village, which is a very centrally located neighborhood within Philadelphia. And I actually walk to work because in my research lab, we rent space from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Funny enough, they sublet out space, and we were fortunate to be able to lease some of that space. So my walk starts in Queen Village, right? And interestingly enough, one of the first things you do when you leave Queen Village is you cross this street called South Street. You might have heard about Cruising on South Street from Boyz II Men songs.
Ooh,
there you go.
The Motown Philly song. Yeah, I got that lyric
Philly,
right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about South Street, right, is it was supposed to be an east-west highway that was going across the city. And the neighborhoods actually actively fought against it. And during this time, property values all around what was going to be a highway essentially went from low to essentially near zero, right? So my home was bought by the prior owner for $1 because no one wanted to live by a highway construction site, no less by a major highway when it was done. And so kind of really interesting to think about the street you cross, and I cross all the time, that could have and was going to be a highway, But as of 1974, it got taken off the docket, and they actually moved it a bit further north, funny enough, to where I am right now, right by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. But all to say is this kind of major housing transportation nexus and a history that could have been very different is just a stone's throw from my house, right?
Did they ever do any demolition before that freeway? I'm thinking of, Mike, through Beverly Hills on, I can't remember if it's Santa Monica Boulevard or somewhere, where there's like a linear park that's just right next to the street. And that was, as I understand it, because they had done a bunch of demolition in preparation for a freeway that was ultimately blocked.
Yeah, that's Santa Monica Boulevard.
Yeah, not that I know of. This is where some of my historian professor colleagues would be much more useful. They didn't get that far. That's the
yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it's pretty amazing. And then I just crossed from there and walked through Society Hill, which is like the oldest, kind of most beautiful part of Philadelphia. Passed by the Liberty Bell and all of those very historic landmarks along the way. And to me, it's really kind of cool to be in the center of a big city, right, where you can have this historic row house neighborhood, and you walk straight up through so much history to work every day, right? And to me, that feels like a very kind of Philly reality.
Yeah.
Or at least the reality that I'm fortunate to live.
Yeah. I recently had the red carpet treatment in Queens Village, of course, hanging out at Vincent's house. I feel that part of my red carpet experience, of course, was hanging out with your family and specifically your young girls who are like working on a PhD in hugs. I mean, they just, in the middle of conversation, just get up and hug you. And it's like, oh, wow, you're so nice.
You're exceptionally huggable, Mike. That's the...
Okay. Well, not everybody would say that. Not even my own family finds me all that huggable these days, but that's having teenagers, I think.
All right, so this time we are talking about a couple of publications by Vincent and his colleagues at Penn and the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation. The first is an article from 2024 in Cityscape titled "The Future of Rental Assistance: Lessons Learned from Implementing and Evaluating a Direct-to-Tenant Cash Assistance Program, PHLHousing Plus." So that one explains your motivations for studying this program, which is an alternative to the Housing Choice or Section 8 voucher program, and then lessons from the setting up of the evaluation study, not really the study itself. The second publication is coming out in mid-July, a little bit after we're recording this episode, and it reports on the trial's outcomes 2 years in, which we got a preview of before this interview. That publication is titled PHLHousing Plus, a randomized controlled trial of a cash-based alternative to the Housing Choice Voucher Program in Philadelphia, PA, telling us exactly what this is about.
You're kind of convincing me here. We need to workshop our titles a little. So maybe at the end we could play with that a little.
I don't know. I mean, I appreciate a title that just tells you exactly what it is. There's no guessing what's going on here.
We're just getting right to it.
Mike Manville would love it. So we have talked about housing vouchers quite a few times now on Housing Voice, which should not be surprising, given that our show's name is an allusion to that very program. Episodes 17, 87, and 88 are all focused squarely on vouchers, and they're a key part of conversations with Beth Shin, Andrew Fenelon, and a few others. So we will not spend much time on background in this episode, I don't think. Keeping it fairly brief, I'll just say that vouchers are the main way we provide rent assistance to low-income households in the United States. And if I've read the HUD dashboard a couple days ago correctly, it serves more than 2.3 million households and costs around $25 to $30 billion a year in its current form. Recipients can use their vouchers to rent housing on the private market, paying no more than 30% of their household income, with the government picking up the difference up to a maximum rent level. Vouchers are a pretty well-regarded means of providing assistance to renters, just broadly speaking, internationally, I think. But as our previous conversations make clear, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is not without its shortcomings, and that includes insufficient funding, for sure, poor performance helping people move into higher opportunity neighborhoods in many cases, and fairly low rates of successful lease-up, especially in more expensive markets with fewer vacancies. Using these vouchers requires landlords to accept them as a form of payment, making it a fairly unique kind of public benefit. And there are various reasons that landlords might be inclined not to accept them, many of which we talked about in episode 87 with Sarah Strochak. There is a hope that if we could skip that step and just give renters the money directly, then we could eliminate a lot of the friction in the current system and improve outcomes in a bunch of different ways. That is the theory, and it's what we're going to talk about today, along with what Vincent and his team found when they actually tested it out in the real world. So here's where I will turn it back over to you, Vincent. I would like to start by having you give us more of the background and motivation behind this direct-to-tenant rental assistance pilot. And I think Philadelphia's experience with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, may be a good entry point. This is kind of how you open your Cityscape article. ERAP was the federal program that helped people with rent in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, sending tens of billions of dollars out across the country. So tell us a bit more about some of the challenges implementing it in Philly and how this effort to provide short-term or one-time assistance to tenants in this emergency context led to an interest in changing the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which serves a quite different purpose than ERAP and is a much more stable program, at least for now.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Shane. And I'm going to actually take one step back because the fun thing about doing something like this is I get to blab away until you cut me off about things that I can't put in papers, right? And so
we can always edit it out. So
fair enough. So interestingly enough, the idea for PHL Housing Plus came out before ERAP because I was very fortunate to have this fellowship that embedded me part-time with the city of Philadelphia, where I was working with the city to help think through housing solutions, right? And I had just worked with them to develop the first ever citywide housing plan. The city wanted to do big, bold things and try new things, acknowledging that, in a city with limited resources, they often couldn't, fund the whole solution to a problem, right, but they could create the inroads for new solutions that we haven't tried thus far that hopefully can expand resources down the road. So with that context in mind, I had actually been working with a colleague at the Center for Guaranteed Income here, Amy Castro, to design for the city of Philadelphia essentially a cash assistance program that was going to be a 1,000-person randomized control trial for the city that the city was actually going to fund through their city budget, right? And so we spent a whole year developing this program, the concept of it. We're talking through talking points. The mayor actually put it in his budget proposal at that time, Mayor Kenny. And then lo and behold, a week later, the city shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Wow. So here we had like a $35 million locally funded 1,000-person randomized control trial of this really interesting, innovative approach to housing assistance. And we got the kind of rug pulled out from under us as everyone across the country did during that time, right?
Yeah.
Enter ERAP, right? So the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, clearly something very different, responding to a pandemic, meant to provide emergency relief. But one of the things that happened was because I was working so closely with the city, quickly pivoted to help them think about this program, right? And one of the things that became very apparent from this program in Philly, and Philly was in some ways the first mover in that some people were kind of developing their programs on day one, others waited a little bit to see what funding rules said, all these kinds of things. But one thing that was very clear is you had to get money out the door very quickly. Right. And you had to deliver rental assistance through whole new systems that often didn't exist for a city, right? Because as you know well, public housing authorities administer the housing voucher program, not cities themselves. Yeah. But then beyond that, you needed to make sure it got into people's hands, essentially no matter what, right? And not no matter what with no strings attached at all, but a big no matter what was regardless potentially of whether an owner wanted to receive the rental assistance or not, right? One of the early challenges faced by ERAP programs was one, highlighting the fact that oftentimes cities don't have relationships with a lot of property owners. So there's not easy mechanisms for them to reach them. There's a lot of reasons why owners are distrustful of cities, right? And so all to say is enter that landscape where you're trying to get money to tenants through them very, very quickly. You can get into a lot of frictions, right? And so the city of Philadelphia realized off the bat, even with limited resources, that they were having a really hard time getting ERAP funds into the hands of tenants who are applying for the assistance. Some of these tenants didn't know who their owner was. Some of the process of getting owner consent was arduous. And sometimes it worked out well, but a lot of times it actually didn't. So acknowledging that the city of Philadelphia was actually one of the first to quickly pivot to say, hey, can we actually offer these funds directly to the tenant, right?
Mm-hmm. Just as a tangent, is there do you know the reason that a landlord would not make it as easy as possible for the tenant to get these ERAP funds? I'm sure there's good reasons, but it just seems like why would they turn down this money?
Well, yeah, in the city of Philadelphia, where essentially less than half of our properties are actually even registered with the city, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's already kind of like a lack of initial engagement. In some ways, because of politics of the past, the legitimate skepticism of the city government. And I think there was a lot of fear at first of what would these funds actually mean for some of those owners, right? Was just funds during the pandemic to give to folks to solve current rent arrears, or was this going to come with other obligations? Early
Right.
emergency rental assistance programs tried to often tie on things like you can't evict someone for a certain period of time,
Yeah.
all these other kind of
So like if I accept
qualifications.
this money, then am I now obligated to
Right.
not evict this person until this emergency is over? Even though that generally was true regardless, I think, but I could see how you could,
Yes.
jump to conclusions about other things being required that you don't even know yet.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So
Okay.
it kind of opens up a potential Pandora's box for some folks who, are already kind of shell shocked as we all were in the beginning of the pandemic and trying to figure out what's going on, and created a real moment of friction. And so worked with the city of Philadelphia very quickly to pivot. And at that time, Paul Williams had also been testing this out when he was with the city of Chicago. We're essentially the first two places to say, hey, we think we actually have the authority to give the money directly to tenants if an owner does not agree to enter the program, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing that, it laid a lot of the kind of groundwork and thinking of what could a direct-to-tenant program actually look like.
Mm-hmm.
As my center, we then actually worked with the city of Los Angeles on this very policy as well. They
Right.
were, I think, possibly the third and by far the largest city to initially move to this direct-to-tenant option because they were facing this challenge. As you know well, Maxine Waters, who was one of the big champions of a lot of the emergency relief funds going around housing and helped construct a lot of those programs, quickly saw the challenges that LA was facing and leaned into a lot of the ways to make this program more efficient throughout the whole life of that program, but not the least of which was early on with exploring, hey, could we do this direct-to-tenant model, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which in many ways was actually never really done or was only done once before the voucher program was created at a national scale. And so really pushed against a lot of priors that we all have around housing assistance that we think is actually based on evidence. But what's interesting is in building the case for the initial pilot before the ERAP came in, and then in talking about ERAP, you realize there's actually little empirical evidence at all testing this kind of direct-to-tenant option.
Yeah.
And so it opened up kind of a world of opportunities that allowed us to pivot and then raise some private capital through philanthropy. The city put in some of their own flexible money and essentially develop a smaller pilot that we ultimately launched in 2022.
Cool.
Yeah, I wonder if LA's rental registry helped with that distribution here locally, because we established that only for our rent stabilized housing stock, but that's the majority of multifamily housing and maybe the majority of all rentals in the city. And that was back in 2017 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I know not all landlords are registered still, which is crazy to me, but hundreds of thousands of them are. And so there is some, it's not even, as I understand, it doesn't provide direct information about the tenants, but it's a level of knowledge about ownership and which units are leased up and even like the rent they're paying and things like that, that most cities just have no insight into directly.
Oh, absolutely. And then you just have like a lot of noise of different policies going on. So we actually did a survey of LA owners at that time. I know we're not talking about ERAP, but I'll just kind of do this one quick. And one thing that became clear is that there were local ordinances being passed around evictions in LA that were independent actually of the rental assistance program.
Right.
But it's really confusing for folks because government's government, right?
Yeah.
And so there was actually the strong misconception that a lot of the local ordinances were actually tied to the emergency rental assistance funds, which they weren't. They were coterminous, right? So it's almost like you were better to accept the funds because you were subject to these rules anyway. But naturally, it was easy for folks to feel confused about what was actually pushing the regulations on them in different forms. And so I think for LA, while they had this great registry, and in many ways actually had a lot of really interesting engagement with owner groups and everything else, there was clearly a lot of broader policy making going on at the city level and the state level that made it hard for people to discern, where the regulations were really were coming from at the time.
Yeah. So in the first article, you say how you were hoping to test 3 outcomes in this trial, or 3 kind of categories of outcome. And I think reviewing them first will be a good way of explaining the motivations for trying out direct-to-tenant rental assistance, a little bit more of the frictions that you mentioned. We'll get into program design later, but for now, listeners can just think of direct-to-tenant rent assistance as simply taking whatever amount the voucher would have paid to a landlord and instead depositing that into a bank account, or in this case, I think a preloaded debit card for the tenant each month. We'll go through each of these sets of outcomes one at a time, and we'll start with reduced administrative burden. You talk about burden from the perspectives of 3 different groups: tenants, landlords, and public housing authorities. What are those burdens, and how do we think that direct cash assistance might reduce or even eliminate them?
Yeah, so some of the stuff here I imagine is going to kind of reiterate stuff some folks have said in the past, right? But we know that, for tenants, there's, aside from the whole process of applying for vouchers and waiting a long time and being called off the wait list, which is a very long, arduous process, once you're actually offered a voucher, there's significant paperwork that needs to be done to actually get you through the process. And one of the things you have to do then is go on the private market and find an owner who will accept this form of rental assistance, right? Some owners might not know what a Section 8 voucher is, so there's kind of the burden of educating folks what this thing is and how you can use it. Some owners do and have preconceived notions of what the actual kind of program is or isn't, legitimate or illegitimate, right? And so with that too, though, for a tenant, even once you maybe find a unit that will accept your voucher, you then have to actually get your unit inspected through a formal inspection process. And so what that does is actually increases time and friction for me actually being able to use the voucher and move into the unit. It also means there's a scenario where that unit could fail, right? And now I actually have to go look for another unit. Maybe possibly while I'm on the verge of homelessness, right? And really housing unstable in this moment. And so what you realize in the normal voucher program, there's, aside from kind of a lot of paperwork, there's ultimately a lot of process that actually leads to, that to ultimately gets to someone to leasing up a unit, that gets to that scenario where we get to that 60% number nationally, right? 40% of people who are finally offered a voucher are not able to actually rent a unit with it. We looked at that in LA, and that number is even dramatically lower, right? It's 56% for once offered a voucher, but if you go even before that phase, it's dramatically lower than that.
Yeah.
And so all to say that the tenant's facing all of these frictions when all they're trying to do is use the benefit that they're being offered, because ultimately they can't use it unless an owner says yes. They say yes to not just receiving it, but all the structure of the program that HUD has around it as well, right? In this project, we realized very quickly that there's been actually little experimenting on how much of that process actually leads to better outcomes for folks with respects to not just finding a unit, but also the quality of the unit, where it is, all that kind of stuff. Similarly, for an owner, right? I was just looking to rent my unit. Someone approached me with a voucher. This potentially could be a good thing because a portion of it's coming from the federal government. So that's actually kind of a guaranteed or a more guaranteed payment stream. And I could view it positively that way. But at the same time, there's a lot of set structures and rules that I have to adhere to actually join this program and have you in it. And then once you're in it, there's a lot of regulatory structures about engaging with voucher households. They're fairly straightforward, but when we think of the fact that the idea of renter protections are actually pretty minimal or non-existent in many markets, you have a program that has even some slight, very rational protections, and it becomes a layer of burden for an owner who has a counterfactual of another tenant who doesn't come with any of these restrictions or rules, right?
Right.
And then beyond that, there's a housing authority that's going through this long process of calling people off waiting lists, getting people to come in, fill out paperwork, making sure all the paperwork's correct, bringing people through that inspection process, going through the whole leasing process, going through all of these recertifications along the way, right? And so on all 3 dimensions, you have folks essentially kind of being exposed to a set of process that's just a function of trying to bridge this contract between owner, tenant, and government, right? Whereas normally the relationship is just owner and tenant. And so in that, it creates a lot, not just time, but cost for all the parties involved, and leads to a lot of scenarios where there's kind of failed cases of someone being able to lease a unit with the voucher that's suboptimal for the tenant, for the housing authority that has to go through this whole paperwork process with them again, but then also potentially for that owner who then is still looking for someone to actually lease their unit.
And this is all fairly paternalistic in a way as well, right? And I think there are costs and benefits or trade-offs to kind of paternalistic policies like this, right? But, specifically, we don't give the money to the tenant, right? That payment goes directly to the landlord. And so we're very clearly specifying what the money can and cannot be used for. And then we don't trust them to, find a decent home, or what we kind of provide our own standards as governments and housing authorities for the unit by, inspecting the unit above and beyond what the tenant inspects, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's good and bad reasons for these things to be embedded in the voucher program, but, it's just kind of worth thinking about, like, why we don't trust people with the money and with the decision-making process, right?
Right. And it also makes a lot of assumptions about, like, the way the housing market works, right?
Yeah.
Some people pay their rent in installments, not at the first of the month. There's kind of a lot of income volatility over the course of a month that someone can't smooth with a voucher, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of informality in our housing market with respects to lease structures, living arrangements, right? The voucher program has very strong rules about, what a household is and whose income counts towards that household income, and a lot of other factors like that, right? That actually don't map on often to the way the housing market works for a lot of folks, but particularly for low-income folks in the rental market.
This is veering into current events and current policy proposals, but I think there is a proposal in the Republican House bill or something along those lines. Maybe it's just by the presidential administration to limit vouchers to only a 2-year term, and once you've used that, you're done. And, I think there's obvious reasons why that would be disastrous for a lot of people. But something I actually hadn't thought about is from the perspective of a landlord, if you know that this is only going to last 2 years and then you're going to have to find a new tenant again because there's a good chance they're going to have to move out. That's just one more reason actually not to accept vouchers and could really lower the lease up rates even more.
Yeah, we can have a whole episode on the arbitrary 2 years and why that's a really inefficient setup. But I agree, that's another important kind of cost. And these are transaction costs for folks, right, that people actually think about and account for when making decisions about where to live and who to lease to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's the rationale for why direct-to-tenant assistance might reduce administrative burdens for all these different groups. Next up is its potential to improve lease-up rates and tenant choice in housing options. And I feel like we're already sort of getting here. What are the problems with vouchers here, and how might direct assistance help?
Yeah, so here, as kind of alluded to already, we know that a lot of folks can't use their voucher. And to jump ahead to one of our findings, right, if you're giving the money directly to the tenant, the odds of getting to 100% use rate is a lot higher. And so there's a reality of taking out that kind of middle ground of having to negotiate a contract actually increases someone's ability to find housing and lease housing with assistance that they're providing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the challenges and the travesties of this voucher program right now, aside from it being dramatically underfunded and tons of research has shown 4 to 5 households for everyone who actually uses one, is that a lot of folks, when offered one, can't use it. And for those folks who can't use it, their counterfactual is quite dire, right, in the trade-offs that they have to actually make. So all to say is that when we think of our 60% use rate for the voucher program nationally, it's not just a problem of, the program doesn't work for everyone. It's that who it doesn't work for, those folks are really worse off as a result of it.
Yeah.
So all to say is that this cash program could actually help with lease up, in that it's essentially, again, reducing that administrative burden and giving more agency to the tenant in actually finding the unit and flexibility even of what that unit looks like. And by virtue of doing that, it opens up their choice set, right? So in our model right now, there's no inspection requirement for this program in order to lease up your unit. And so that means that a household is making a decision about unit quality, unit location in a way that you or I normally do, right? I live in Philadelphia where there's no such thing as a proactive housing inspection. So my housing inspection, when I go rent a unit, is me going to rent that unit and deciding that it's a good enough quality relative to all the other things I'm looking for in that housing unit. So all to say is that it kind of gives more agency to the tenant to find a unit that matches their needs and to be able to then successfully lease up the unit with the subsidy that's trying to get them into housing.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing you were interested in was greater flexibility and the ways that might lead to better housing outcomes. Tell us how traditional vouchers can end up restricting recipients' options and how cash assistance might open up more of them. I was particularly interested in how direct assistance could help tenants stay in their current homes, which was something that also came up in our conversation with Sarah Strochak. And I think it feels underappreciated as a common use of vouchers. It certainly was by me, maybe just because so much voucher research focuses on moving to opportunity rather than staying in place.
Yep, exactly. So there's an interesting, and that's a great point, right? We've focused rightfully on the idea of ensuring neighborhood access and what that can mean for someone's kind of economic mobility and growth and well-being. But a lot of times a stable housing situation could be the best thing for someone's economic well-being and mobility. And so this idea, right, that for a lot of tenants who are offered a voucher, they might not actually be able to lease their current unit they're living in and would therefore have to move, is a real challenging one for that individual, right? Because there's a cost of moving, right? There's social costs, there's financial costs. You have to have another unit you'd actually move to. But then beyond that, even if you rent your current unit or your future one with the voucher, again, kind of coming back to a point I hit on slightly, my income might come in gradually over the course of a month, right? I could get paid daily. I could get paid weekly. I could get paid biweekly, right? Sometimes we have income shocks that come up in a week, this week, that I didn't expect, but I can recover from it next week. Mm-hmm. When I have something like cash assistance, I have the autonomy of that flexible dollars in my pocket where I know I'm going to pay rent and I'm budgeting for my rent. And maybe that rent actually isn't all due on the first of the month. Maybe actually I pay my rent in installments because my income flows that way. But then I could trade off across my income and expenses to ensure my rent is paid and I'm able to cover other things that all don't flow in the kind of same way that rent flows. So if I have to spend all my money on rent on the first of the month, right, and then I have nothing for the next 2 weeks, what happens to my other 2 weeks of expenses? So the cash model allows someone to essentially budget and to budget their dollars and to acknowledge the fact that housing is our largest consumption good, but it's not our only. And we often have income coming in through various forms, particularly for low-income housing households, that then allows me to essentially smooth my housing consumption and smooth my other consumption that could really improve not just my housing outcomes, but a broader set of outcomes, right? I can afford to actually pay for the daycare this way. I can not take out a loan to act as a bridge towards certain costs, right? That I know I have every single month. And that's a real level of financial autonomy that's desirable, right? From an economic perspective for individuals, but also societally for the way we want people to budget money and the way we essentially do budget money.
I was at the Wu-Tang concert a week ago. Almost exactly 1 week ago.
Great transition.
And as everybody listening knows, cash rules everything around me, right? Cream. That's the Wu-Tang taught us that. Economists teach us that. Vincent just taught you that. This is what we do. Cash rules everything around me.
Well, and I mean, and back to your paternalism comment too, I think there's this, this comes back to essentially not trusting people to budget for themselves.
100%.
But speaking as someone who makes a lot more money now than I did 15 years ago, I was budgeting much more carefully when I was younger and poorer than I am today. And so this idea that, poor people don't know how to budget, like they're more experienced at it than anyone. Okay. So I think we can start getting into the evaluation itself. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, this was a randomized controlled trial, right, in the title of the paper, which is described as the gold standard of experimental design, a phrase we've used probably literally every episode that RCTs have come up on this show. And I think every researcher says gold standard whenever RCTs come up and you have to explain it to non-researchers. These kinds of trials allow researchers to make plausible claims about causality. So, for example, if your RCT was designed well and you found that tenants who received direct cash assistance ended up in lower poverty neighborhoods or with less evictions on average than those receiving vouchers or not receiving anything, then it's likely that the direct assistance program was responsible for that outcome, and you can make that claim. Give us a quick overview of how you selected the different groups in this RCT, randomized controlled trial, and the kind of intervention or treatment that each group received.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, one, for promoting the potential benefits of RCTs, right? But also to just use that to reiterate that this was very much a learning opportunity, right? We developed a pilot to learn. This wasn't the creation of a permanent program. It was the acknowledgement that there were so many priors set up in our current way of providing housing assistance that we've never tested or learned from, that we really should learn from this, which is why the idea of designing this program, both as a pilot, but then one that followed a randomized controlled trial kind of format, was really important for the city itself. And I can't speak highly enough to the city and its leadership for acknowledging that, right? That's not something that every city is jumping to do because it requires a lot of thought and process on the front end about how you're actually enrolling people and a commitment throughout the whole thing. I mean, we're such good partners with the city in that way. And they've made a lot of decisions to ensure we can actually study and measure this. And so,
there's a risk too there of what if the results are not as you hope, and then the city kind of they're going to take some responsibility for that, rightly or wrongly. And so there's a risk there as well. But I do think you're talking about, I think it was $70 million or so total. Is that right?
Originally, the pilot was going to be $35 million. It's much less than that now.
So let's say, in the tens of millions of dollars to potentially influence a program that, as I said, spends $25+ billion a year nationally. And I think this would probably not be the first program to potentially influence the Housing Choice Voucher program over its long tenure. But please continue.
Yeah, so one of the things we knew is we were trying to first kind of figure out how many folks could we actually fund, what would be a sample size that can get us to some statistical significance, and then how do we actually enroll them? And we landed on 300 people. Initially, the pilot was going to be 3 years. 300 folks getting cash sized like a voucher. And then within that, though, we knew that we didn't want to just study some cash assistance program or cash transfer program. We wanted to study it with respects to, not just as kind of factual of a control group of getting no assistance, but also the folks in the traditional Section 8 voucher program, right? To see, what was working better within the two programs and how do they actually complement each other or replace each other in different ways.
Because there's not much question that giving people cash is better than giving them nothing at all. The control, a control group of nothing. But whether it leads to better outcomes or there are trade-offs associated with, compared to vouchers, that's a real open question that I think we could have intuitions about, but no one really knows.
I would say on the whole, right, when we first proposed this idea, I was like a little bit of a heretic in regards to folks were actually very skeptical of giving folks cash and said they're not going to spend it on housing, right? They will spend it on a lot of other things and they will be just as worse off and will spend all that money on nothing.
Yeah, or even more so because they'll say they spend it all on drugs and alcohol and you're going to, all the things that come from that. This came up in our episode.
Or it's a work disincentive.
Yeah, with Jay-Z Zhao, our episode on unconditional lump sum cash transfers to people experiencing homelessness. This, was a big concern. Of course, they found actually the opposite was true, but
and a lot of research shows that, right? And similarly, though, the voucher folks were very concerned that we were somehow kind of undermining the premise of rental assistance and potentially, making a case against the voucher program when it was never meant to be an either or. It's kind of a both end, right? We need a broader spectrum of assistance products, right, to ensure that folks can be actually access the assistance and benefit from it.
Yeah.
That's a premise of a recent paper with Kathy O'Regan and some other colleagues that we published in Housing Policy Debate. But all to say is, in coming up, one of the things we didn't want to do, right, was essentially put out a big call for a program where we could only serve 300 folks. So we acknowledge the fact that the Public Housing Authority locally has wait lists for its Section 8 voucher program and its public housing program. And so we approached the Public Housing Authority and we said, hey, would you mind if we actually used your wait list for enrolling people in the study? So one of the things we wanted to do when we did this, though, in enrolling people in the study is not cause kind of a challenge of people trying to decide between one benefit versus the other. So we knew that there were going to be folks who are offered vouchers in the months and year to come, right? So we can enroll 300 households, say, who are entering the voucher program if PHA agrees to offer our program to the next 300 folks on those wait lists, right? And again, those folks on the wait list are randomly on the wait list, right? They gotta put their name on a wait list, they get assigned a random number, right? And so they're randomized on this wait list already. And so we said, okay, so the next 300 folks who are offered a voucher, can you offer our study to them? And ideally, hopefully they enroll in our study and we can see the impact of a voucher on these folks, right? What we also know is because the wait lists were so long is that we could actually go to the end of the wait list, the people furthest away who are going to be waiting, and say, hey, while you're waiting, do you want to receive cash for 3 years? Doesn't preclude you, it doesn't take you off the wait list. If you somehow get called off the wait list because it's moving way faster than anyone projected, you can actually move to the other subsidy, and you should, because that's a permanent program. But while you're waiting, would you be willing to enroll in this study? And then you have a whole bunch of folks in between those two groups. So you have two tails. And in the middle, you have essentially all these other folks who are waiting, who are likely going to be offered a voucher or public housing sooner because they're just kind of closer to the part of the list that's being called on. And so we contacted over 1,000 of them to say, hey, would you be willing to fill out a survey every 6 months, and we'll reimburse you $50 for the survey just to hear about your housing experiences. And so with that, we essentially took the randomization that occurs from these wait lists to use that to essentially randomize for our group and select a treatment group, which is the cash group, a control group, which is the no assistance group, and another group, which is the voucher group, right? And so we essentially got the benefit of randomization without having to go through a process of asking a whole lot of people to sign up for a program and reject a whole bunch of people from it, and then ask them if they're willing to be in our control group and all those kinds of things. And so I was really kind of proud of this approach because I think it's a really sensitive way of trying to create a program and enroll folks in it to adhere to the RCT model. But to me, it was also really huge testament of the city and the housing authority and their interest in learning here and their ability to work really cohesively together and with researchers. And so it was a really kind of bit of a road to come up with that design and operationalize it. But I think ultimately it's really allowed for a really good experimental setting.
Those people at the end of the wait list, is there a general sense for how long they would probably be waiting for a voucher? Are we talking 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? I know it varies a lot city to city.
Yeah, I mean, we were fairly convinced that the lion's share would not get called up within the life of the program. And so we weren't sure the exact timeline, but and our research has shown that we've thus far been able to maintain a lot of folks within those respective groups and not have too much flow. We've had some flow from one group to another. It actually presents another whole learning opportunity about cash being an on-ramp to a voucher, right? Which we have folks doing. But all to say is that generally the design has remained fairly consistent with respects to groups.
So yeah, those are the groups in this study. Now let's talk about how the participants actually receive this direct cash assistance, receive their benefits, and how much they receive, because it's a little more complicated than I outlined earlier, just for the sake of moving us forward. So with vouchers, the amount a household receives is just that difference between 30% of their household income and the rent itself, up to a certain fair market rent, which is usually like the 40th percentile rent in the city or zip code or whatever. But with cash assistance, there's no way of knowing in advance exactly how big that gap is going to be between income and rent because you don't know where they're renting, and so you can't know the rent. So tell us how you tackled that problem and what the results were in terms of how much money people were getting, generally speaking.
Yeah, so this is a really important dimension, not for just explaining the program, but also why this isn't like a universal basic income program or a guaranteed income program, right? The guaranteed income programs, universal basic income programs have like a set dollar amount, right, that everyone gets, and they're testing a dollar amount, which is a floor. And there's a really interesting studies, a lot of great work going on there. What this is assistance level, kind of a cash assistance determined based on your income level and rent levels, right? So in a city like Philadelphia, we follow these things called small area fair market rents, where essentially rents are calculated based on, and I'm sure this has come up at various points already in the series, right?
See episode 17 with
there you go. See episode
Collinson.
17. And so, basically calculating vouchers at micro levels to account for the fact that rent isn't equal across the whole city. It varies by neighborhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the city of Philadelphia has 3 zones. That this is the way they've done their small area fair market rent program. Is they have a high cost neighborhoods, medium cost neighborhoods, and low cost neighborhoods.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought the only way it operated was just at the zip code level.
Yeah. Same.
No, yeah, you actually get a fair amount. So they've kind of merged zip codes into one of those 3 groups to essentially reduce the administrative burden on all ends.
Yeah.
And it helps a little bit in a city like Philadelphia where there isn't as wide a variance in rents as some other markets, right? If you got to a place like LA and some other markets, the high is so high and the low can still be somewhat low, right? And so, not so much anymore, but all to say is that in Philadelphia, rents aren't as widely dispersed price-wise.
Mm-hmm.
So within that, those small area fair market rents set the kind of rent max. But then we know that someone's rental subsidy is based on the difference between 30% of their income towards the housing and what the rent is for that unit. So what we have is essentially like a variable dollar amount that everyone's receiving, right? Because our incomes vary. And not only do we live in different small area FMR areas potentially, but also the unit we ultimately rent could be different or below any number below that small area fair market rent. So this is an interesting design feature, right? And decision we had to make. In theory, we could just say everyone gets the difference. So the small area fair market rent is treated as essentially what the rent is for that area. But we actually looked at people's actual rent levels. And so someone didn't get any arbitrage between their rent and the small area fair market rent. There's some models on direct rental assistance that are exploring whether to essentially allow households to capture that value. Ours did not because we wanted to follow the voucher program in its totality, where in the voucher program, you essentially, your actual rent level is what determines the kind of maximum rent for the unit. So all to say is that in the cash program, there's a scenario where, the median payment, assistance payment to an individual is about $881. It's varied over time, $885, $880, but it kind of goes to some pretty extremes where there's essentially one household where the assistance is upward of $2,000. That's an extreme outlier.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another few households whose payment is well below $500, right? And so it's a variable subsidy amount to folks along the way, though we do have a very kind of dramatic clumping in the middle where that actual median is.
And I'm sure the same is true with vouchers as well, where for some households, especially over time as their income changes, either, the amount is going up a lot or going down a lot.
That's exactly right. And
hopefully more often going down as their incomes climb.
Yeah. And that distribution, we have for the voucher holders as well, kind of holds fairly consistent. Although, funny enough, in our sample, the voucher households somehow have slightly lower incomes, only slightly, and therefore slightly higher median assistance payments.
Mm-hmm. Well, thinking through the lease-up process, I think a big question about cash assistance is how you deal with tenant screening requirements, and I think particularly income requirements. It's not uncommon for landlords to require applicants to have a monthly income that's at least 3 times greater than rent. This is a number I hear a lot. And an extra, let's say $1,000 a month won't often be enough to get there for a lot of people to that 3 times multiple. And even if it is, the landlord might see from the income verification that this is not regular employment income, or maybe it hasn't even been showing up in the tenant's bank account because they're just enrolling in this program. So it's never shown up before. There's no way to show it other than with, some evidence from the city. And in that case, it's easy to imagine the same discrimination experienced by voucher holders being duplicated here, and maybe even exacerbated because with cash assistance, the landlord doesn't have a guarantee that they'll receive the payments, unlike with vouchers. So, these were all concerns you were well aware of course. So I'm curious how you thought about them and any solutions you devised or ways that you're working through this.
Yeah, and that's a really important point and one thing we wanted to learn about. Coming in, there was not like some full-scale belief that a cash program is going to outperform the voucher program on every metric. It's that there were going to be clear trade-offs that folks are going to make, right, or face. And we need to really understand both if those exist and to what magnitude, right? And so one of the clear things in the voucher program is this idea of, trying to help people not just lease a unit with a voucher, but essentially to move to neighborhoods with better performing schools, lower exposure to violent crime, all those kinds of things, right? And so with supports from the voucher program, but also maybe the confidence from an owner knowing the money is coming from the federal government and it's going to come in on any given month, maybe that could increase the odds that, someone would be willing to lease to someone who seems lower income and therefore less able to pay. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things we're interested in is, are there going to be kind of neighborhood opportunity trade-offs? And that's one of the things long-term we're actually looking at. But I think a couple realities came to the forefront for us, right? One is that, but for some MTO agencies moving to opportunity agencies, leaning into really innovative approaches to thinking about security deposits and that kind of 3-month requirement, the voucher program on its own actually isn't equipped to address a lot of those things either, right? So folks are already kind of facing a lot of those natural market frictions when trying to use even conventional form of rental assistance. And there are some pilots that are kind of experimenting around that in really important ways.
Well, I do want to just interject here really quick, because I think the distinction here, or one distinction, is that with vouchers, you have to go through the whole inspection process. So there's no hiding the fact that you are using a voucher. Yes. Yep, and I think part of the appeal of cash assistance is the landlord doesn't need to know where your money's coming from, because they really don't. It shouldn't matter.
Source of income discrimination becomes, kind of impossible, right?
And so I do think I bring this up just because I think that's sort of a selling point of cash assistance. But then there's this very real hurdle in that process.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And so one of the things we did is we offered all households actually got a letter saying their subsidy amount, right, that they could actually provide to a landlord on city letterhead if they so choose. The city actually in this program also is kind of shown a lot of commitment to administering the program. And so everyone in this program, they have an email address of someone at the city who answers within 2 hours, if not sooner. And with that,
wish I could get that service.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any city hotline that with those kind of results.
Well, this is where administrative burden comes in, right? If you don't have to spend all of your time trying to get someone through 10 inspections to actually lease up a unit, you could actually use that time for other things, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of thinking about where some of that time could be used differently in program administration is a really interesting component of this. But that said, the tenant can also essentially ask the city to even engage with the landlord directly if they so choose. So we gave them the option. Interestingly, very few people in our program have actually used that option, if any. It's literally less than a handful. And I think the reality is that for a lot of folks, the ability to pay on day one with rent, with money, was potentially more beneficial to them than kind of the other assurances through a traditional voucher program for ensuring really fast 100% lease-up rates, right? Yeah. And the flexibility, again, of what the unit actually can be then also accelerates that component as well, right? You don't not only have to not have to go through an inspection, but you're again making that choice as normal renters do about housing quality and other things. And so all to say is that, we found 100% uptake rate and housing rate from the program right away, which is a big kind of initial finding of difference versus the voucher program where it's more around the mid 70s in Philadelphia, right? So still fairly high compared to the national average. But overall, right, there's kind of that difference in lease-up rate that we've seen already in our findings.
I could also imagine, even if you really did struggle to find a landlord who would rent to you, that, you have this cash now. And so your options for finding a friend to stay with or a family member and to actually contribute something is much more substantial versus, if you have a voucher, you can't use that to move in with a friend.
Yeah, no, exactly.
To take over their lease or something or pay your part of it. That's just not an option.
Yep, exactly.
So we've started to hint at some of the findings, but we're going to get into them fully here now. You used surveys, administrative data, and interviews to track outcomes for participants over the first 2 years, with survey check-ins every 6 months. Let's start with the effect of direct cash assistance on two of the most catastrophic outcomes for low-income households, which are eviction and homelessness. So what did you find there?
So I would say one thing, just to kind of go to what you just said, we've been very fortunate in that in these 6-month surveys, they're fairly long and exhaustive. Folks get reimbursed for it. And we've been able to maintain an 80+% response rate on the whole over the course of our different survey rate waves, which has been really wonderful for being able to measure outcomes. And with these outcomes, with the survey, one of the things you're really able to do is kind of look at a broader set of measures, right? So for homelessness, clearly there's formal homelessness, which is kind of engagement with the homeless services systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of forms of informal homelessness that exist for individuals, staying with a friend or a family member for a night or multiple nights, sleeping in your car, sleeping in a hotel or motel. And so one of the things we do in this paper, and in our study particularly, is hone in on the idea that homelessness is kind of a spectrum of potential forms it could take, and not kind of discounting anything less than formal homelessness in a homeless shelter and the homeless system in some way, homelessness system, response system, as not experiencing some form of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
So when we construct these variables, similarly, right, an eviction, we know there's formal evictions where someone actually goes through a court process, but we also know very well that there's a lot of informality in evictions where people are essentially forced out of their units. They're locked out. There's kind of different things that can go on. And so with that as well, we're able to ask a lot of nuanced questions about the forms of housing stability and instability, the duration, and kind of look at these things in really nuanced ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing I think that's a real kind of power of the surveys. In the long term, also, we have a lot of administrative data we're linking to that allows us to look at some of those traditional hard measures as well. And so what we're talking about here today is distinctly those survey-based responses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things, again, with this experimental design, and please stop me if I get too wonky, but we have these things called intent to treat and treatment on the treated. So with the voucher program, we know that there's a number of folks who can't use the voucher, but they're actually offered the voucher, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're essentially received some form of treatment, even though they did not actually use the voucher in the end. And that's a really important part of the voucher story, right? We have a lot of research that focuses specifically on folks who are able to use a voucher. And there's a multitude of research showing the positive impacts, as you've discussed already, of vouchers on household outcomes. But to really understand the program, you need to also include the folks that are essentially falling out, right?
Yep.
And not able to use the benefit. And so with this in the study, what we find and test is kind of essentially cash, right? And we know 100% of our group were able to use it versus a control group who received no assistance. And for the voucher group, we're able to actually look at, the folks who were offered a voucher, everyone who was offered it, regardless of whether they were able to use it or not, and looking at their outcomes relative to folks who are not offered a voucher, as well as folks who just were offered it and were able to use it relative to the actual kind of control group as well. So there's a lot of kind of nuance and levels in these findings.
Mm-hmm.
But what we see off the bat, even from the first survey wave for the cash group, is just dramatic reductions in evictions. We see like over a third drop in evictions by the first wave for households, and that effect essentially actually increases over time. Similarly, for homelessness, we see a real dramatic drop initially for homelessness of the individuals, and this is accounting for all forms of homelessness, nearly 30% in the first wave, and then it grows from there in each successive wave as well.
To a bigger reduction.
Yeah. Exactly.
And this is for the cash recipients compared to the control group of people who did not receive any. They were just still on the wait list.
Exactly. And so we're seeing, what's really powerful here, right, is that at the end of the day, this is a program where we're telling folks this is a housing assistance program, but we're not doing any check to say, did you pay your rent? Show me a rent stub, right? We're not giving it to the owner. We're giving it to the tenant and saying, this is the intent of the program.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing ultimately is the outcomes we care about the most, which is the housing stability ones, right? For eviction and homelessness going down dramatically, both initially and then kind of maintaining and growing over the course essentially of the program itself. Importantly, right, we don't want to create some like one is better than the other of cash versus vouchers. I think there's a lot of multidimensionality here of who a subsidy could be better for at what point, and we shouldn't ever treat these programs as a binary either or.
Yeah.
Because as we know, housing markets are complex and people's needs are also complex. But we find actually, interestingly enough, for eviction and homelessness, especially compared to that group, the intent to treat group, which is just the folks offered the voucher, some of whom essentially were not able to use it and some were, we're finding kind of larger coefficient sizes for the cash group relative to the control group than we are finding for the voucher group relative to the control group. That said, a really positive story here is vouchers also work really well, right? They are also dramatically reducing homelessness and evictions as well. And so they're both working really well, although in some respects we're seeing larger coefficient sizes and effect sizes for the cash group relative to the control group for homelessness and eviction.
Yeah. And as you know, one type of assistance might work better for one set of families or people with particular needs, and one set of assistance might work better for others.
That's the follow-up study.
Yeah, the Galaxy Brain policy will be like being able to kind of triage those people into different buckets, but we're not at that point. That's all extremely promising. Another thing that I think that you were able to look at and that people would have questions about are serious housing quality concerns, right? You asked people to report on things like fire or water damage, extreme heat or cold, broken doors or locks, no functioning fridge or stove, and things like that. And, as we've noted, I think people would be potentially concerned that without an inspection process, the cash assistance group might not fare as well. What were some of the results that you guys found?
Yeah, so there, again, importantly, across both groups, cash relative to control group and voucher relative to control group, we find positive improvements on housing quality, right? Again, these are self-reported, but kind of multiple dimensions, as you just mentioned. With the cash group, particularly their first move to a new unit, we actually see essentially like a 21% improvement in their overall self-reported housing quality, or reduce odds of reporting some of these, bad housing quality standards. We are finding a bigger effect size for the voucher group. And that means that for folks who are able to use a voucher, there could actually be a benefit to that inspection and seeing actual a larger coefficient housing quality improvement than the treatment group. But again, they're really important that they're both directionally and by size, really important improvements in housing quality, but we are seeing a larger coefficient for the voucher group, which is theoretically what we would expect if those inspections were working, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it is good to know that the inspections are doing something. It's not just an administrative burden, a bureaucratic hurdle that is, contributing nothing at all.
That's right. And that's where this is why it's really important, right, to think about some of this stuff, because it's a series of trade-offs. We often do this thing where we evaluate housing programs based on one outcome, but folks are trading off a broader set of outcomes, and some are placing higher premiums on certain outcomes than others. And so here, right, one program could work a lot better in one setting for one outcome, and in another setting for another outcome. And those are the real kind of trade-offs as we think about it. And that's where I think going forward, I'd like to think we have many papers that are going to come out of this across a whole set of outcomes. We're linking to school data, medical records. There's a lot more we can go into on the housing side. We focus just on households with kids for this study.
That's right.
And lots of kids outcomes that are also going to be at the forefront. I should say, and I should have said this all along, and from the get-go, my colleague Sarah Jaffe, who's in the School of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Psychology, is the other lead investigator on this project. She is just the most amazing colleague and is co-leading all of this work with me. So I should have said her name from the first breath. So apologize for that, Sarah. Way more to come here. And I think, though, really understanding those trade-offs is something we're both particularly excited about going forward.
Yeah. And I don't want to come across as downplaying housing quality at all, because no one should. But I do think the reality is, as you said, the vast majority of people who are eligible for housing vouchers do not receive any because we just don't have enough funding for them.
Yeah.
And those people are not getting these inspections, and they're not getting money. So lots of people are living in these homes and making these decisions about, making these trade-offs and deciding to be able to get into a house, to be able to get into this neighborhood, or this, something about this specific house, despite the concerns I might have on specific things. Like, I'm willing to make that choice. Again, I think there is just a level of trusting people to understand what is in their best interest. You still want standards. I feel like this is where having a more proactive building inspection program, independent of a voucher program, can really help, where you can just ensure that the housing quality across the board is more kind of up to snuff. Because, why should this be something that is limited to people who have vouchers anyway? Everyone should be able to live in housing without serious problems like these. And so, conditioning these inspections only on these vouchers, I understand it's just a matter of resources at the end of the day and priorities. But I think that's probably a better vision for this, is like, people can choose the housing they want, but then it is the city's role, it's some government entity's role to inspect all housing and make sure it's meeting these minimum standards.
Yeah, in 1949, the federal government promised us a decent home and a suitable living environment. Isn't that right? So we're still not there yet.
And I'm, to be clear, I am not saying the government should be inspecting every unit before someone moves in. Landlords, you can back off. I'm just saying a more consistent, in Los Angeles, they do it about every 4 years is, I think, their target. So, and they just kind of let you know about a month in advance and show up and look through, and it takes 10 or 15 minutes.
That's exactly right. And ultimately, at the end of the day, to make programs that work well, or if nothing else, prevent some catastrophic scenario that no one wants on the news, we oftentimes create higher standards than exist in the current market, right? And by virtue of doing that, it creates just a level of administrative burden that maybe is warranted and justified and sounds good and could be really great, but we need to acknowledge is different than what the market's being asked to do on its own, right?
Yeah. Well, I had a question here about lease up, but that's kind of silly because it's 100%, as you say. Everyone gets their money anyway with this program. They don't have to find a landlord to accept it. So we can skip to the end because we're running out of time here anyway. But I just want to wrap up and ask you if there are any big picture takeaways from PHL Housing Plus at the end of 2 years. And really, has the program, it sounds like it's shown enough promise to keep going and expand and try new things. But I guess other than whatever big takeaways you have, I'm curious if there were any unexpected benefits or unintended negative consequences that you came across, whether in the quantitative data or just in these interviews and surveys with people. Were there any surprises?
Yeah, so I guess kind of multiple things to think about here. One, again, realizing I'm remiss to acknowledge Matt Fowle, who is a researcher at my center who's done, at the end of the day, all of the data crunching for us on this, and Mimi Tansky, who's on our research team as well. And without her, that response rate would not exist, amongst many other things she's done. But I think one of the clear takeaways here is not even related to housing, right? It's just more generally acknowledging that as researchers, we really can be strong partners to city officials who want to think creatively about solutions. Rachel Mulberry and Miranda Onberry were amazing partners at the city. And one of the things that we did early on is we established the trust with each other and rapport that was about building a program, building evidence, but also kind of seeing each other as colleagues and a team. And I think at the end of the day, pilots like this don't get created or evaluated without real kind of meaningful partnership, which we've kept doing, right? And has actually led to the city's actually about to announce that it's extending the program and the pilot for another year.
Oh, that's great.
So it's a 3-year turns now into a 4-year pilot, right? Which is really wonderful. And part of that is a product of a lot of our collaboration and the fact that we were able to kind of take early lessons learned and present it to them so they could do real-time policy making and speak to local officials about things like budgets, right? And how to actually fund the program and why you should fund the program. So I think one of the real learning opportunities through all this is that policy actually can be kind of reflective and responsive, but also still adhering to a research design. And those don't have to be in opposition with each other. I think another thing that just is really kind of striking to me is just, I think this is like the age-old academic story of like, we think we know so much and we still have so much yet to learn, right? So much yet to learn about the way rental markets work, the way tenants are engaging with it and using subsidies, the trade-offs that households are making, the way that owners and tenants are engaging with each other. And I think we have a lot of really powerful insights that are going to be coming out from a lot of our qualitative work, a lot of our interviews and other stuff that I think is really going to show a lot of that nuance, which, I think we know that for instance, vouchers work well, but there's a lot that happens while someone's receiving a voucher that actually is kind of intermediating the effect of the voucher, right? And we need to actually know those things and understand them. And so I'm really excited about what's yet to come from what we've collected.
Well, that is exciting to hear. You get to keep studying this for another year, because I'm sure that extra year will make a big difference.
Yeah.
And hopefully these programs can expand to more cities, including ours down here in Los Angeles. So Vincent Reina, thank you for joining us on the Housing Voice podcast. Really appreciate it.
Really fun. Thanks for having me. And make sure to come to Philly. You promised now.
As soon as possible after summer. You can find a link to Vincent's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on the socials. I'm on Blue Sky at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is there at MC-Lens. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.